This lecture's title is Vienna versus Chicago on Monetary Issues. It carries a subtitle, The Many Faces of Monetarism. My objective is going to be twofold. One is to give Friedman his due, and secondly, to make Friedman into an Austrian, although I have to admit in ways that he probably wouldn't appreciate. He's a monetarist. The many faces of monetarism, you'll detect that when you see several times during the lecture I shift gears. I'll try to point it out to you so that it's not too jolting a shift, where Friedman argues at cross purposes with himself. And in fact, it's when he does that that gives us our opportunity to make him into a Hayekian, an Austrian, and by doing that to understand more fully both the Austrian view and the monetarist view. So I'll start out with sort of the kernel of truth and the core ground zero for Milton Friedman's monetarism. And as you might guess, it's the equation of exchange, an equation that I suspect that everyone in this room is familiar with, but in case there are a few that aren't, it's tautological, it's true by definition, and it simply says that if you add up the total amount of money in the economy, that's M, and multiply it by the number of times each of those dollars gets spent on average, that's MV, so that's total spending in the economy, you will get, well, the other side of the equation, which is the level of output as measured by Q. That's output of everything, consumer goods, consumption goods, there's nothing left out there, multiplied by the average price of each item of output. That's the PQ. And, well, PQ is expenditures too. So really both sides represent expenditures. One tabulated by looking at the goods and their prices, and the other tabulated by looking at the quantity of money and how often it gets spent. Okay, you can do it either way, and you better get about the same number. Okay. So it's tautological true as Friedman recognizes, Keynes recognized, and everybody else recognized. There's no debate about that. The only deviation I've made from Friedman's own reckoning is I'm using Q, which means the economy's output, which in the early writing he used that. He recognized, yes, Q is output, he multiplied by P. But when he did his empirical work, he found it much easier to get data on total income rather than total output. The statistics are more readily available in all the different countries he looked at. And after all, real output and real income are the same thing. They measure the same thing. You know, how much real income does the economy enjoy? Well, it's measured by the real output that income will buy. And that real output is the real output of the economy. So Friedman would substitute for the Q a Y. It would be a lowercase y. He used lowercase to indicate a real magnitude. And we're not going to do that because I'm not going to do any empirical work here. I'm going to do theoretical work, and I want to keep the Q. I don't think Friedman would object. Now, Friedman recognized on the basis of his empirical work that velocity doesn't change very much. The number of times on average that people spend $1 this year is going to be the same thing as it was last year almost, and the same thing as it will be next year almost. This is an empirical demonstration that Friedman and his students made over and over. When I say almost, I said it has a mild upward trend, about 1% a year or something like that, between 1 and 2% per year. And over a long period of time, of course, there can be a substantial change in velocity, but from year to year, or even a 5-year period, not much of a change. And that the Q, the output, grows but slowly in the low single digits. And this certainly is true, that no economy doubles its output from one year to the next, or raises it even by 10% or even 5%. Okay, that growth, such as it is in the very low single digits on a long-term basis. This again is an empirical view, and it's a plausible view. You can't double output very quickly at all. And so with those two things nailed down, in other words, with neither Q nor V changing very much over time, then you get a very strong relationship between the price level and the money supply. That is, the price level moves with the money supply. And so if we represent this by arrows, so if M goes up, then P goes up. And if V and Q were actually constant, like Avogadro's number or Planck's constant, they're not that constant, okay? But if they were, then the percentage changes would be identical, wouldn't they? Well, they're not quite that constant, V and Q, but it's close, okay? So prices move almost in lockstep with the money supply, allowing only for some growth and some changes in velocity. And Friedman argued, partly on the basis of statistical evidence and partly on the basis of institutional detail and historical understanding, that the direction of cause and effect went from M to P. It was increases in the money supply that causes prices to rise. This counters a political argument to the effect that we're sorry prices are going up so fast, but we're doing everything we can to print enough money for you to pay those higher prices. Okay, I mean, you hear that, or you'll hear it in this next election. I'm sure that's the politicians would have it the other way, but no, it goes from N to P. You know, that's funny. I guess I'm heartened by the chuckle when I said that, because I can say that to my auditorium full of sophomores. I get nothing. Will this be on the test? That's why I love lecturing at the Mises Institute. Okay, now I don't want to give you the idea that Friedman invented this equation. He didn't. It's one of the oldest equations in all of economics. He revived it. And he revived it as part of what's commonly called, and accurately so, the monetarist counter-revolution. And we have to realize that he was countering Keynes. And to that extent, he was enormously successful. In other words, if you read Keynes, you get the idea that the velocity of money is pretty wild. Keynes talked about the fetish of liquidity. People have psychological attitudes about money. And sometimes they hoard money. Sometimes they dishoard money. They're fetishistic. I like the adjective. They're fetishistic about their decisions on holding money. And it's these changes in the accumulation and the decumulation of hoards that wreaks havoc in the economy, and some extra market force, namely the government, needs to step in and do something about it and make the economy perform more smoothly than it otherwise would. Keynes, writing in the mid-30s, had a habit of writing things like, if we had the data, they would show, blah, blah, and so on. We didn't have the data then. In fact, we got the data precisely because an army of Keynesians led by Kuznets in the U.S. and Richard Stone in England, developed national income accounting where we could get the data. So it was sort of ironic because it was the creation of national income accounts that emerged out of the Keynesian revolution, but it was Friedman who used the data to show just the opposite, because Friedman could say, well, Maynard, we've now got the data, and they don't show anything of the sort. They show that velocity is relatively constant, growth is slow and in the single digits, and that the relationship is not between changes in V and changes in Q, but between changes in M and changes in P. Okay? So what Friedman was able to show, and this is another way of saying the same thing, is that the instabilities that Keynes perceived or thought he perceived were not at all coming from the demand side of the market for money. They were coming instead from the supply side, which is a huge difference. It means the government was causing the problem and not some inherent fetishistic driven propensity on the part of market participants to hoard money or dishoard money. So that's what I mean by giving Friedman his due. At the time, that's just what we all needed. Okay, and by the way, the old quantity theory even as expressed here, was one endorsed by Mises himself. If you read Mises' Theory of Money and Credit, he came down pretty strongly on the side of the quantity theory of money, which he explained he just meant the supply and demand approach to assessing the value of money, and he saw as the alternative, it was the alternative at the time, the state theory of money. In other words, money has its value because it's imbued with value by the state that issues it, and it rejected that, okay? And leaving nothing but the old quantity theory of money, which Mises endorsed. And Mises, of course, is credited for being the first to apply the concepts of marginal utility to the examination of the value of money. Okay. Now, I've shown this cause and effect relationship. It goes from M to P, but with a lag of, look at that, 18 to 30 months. That's a long time, a year and a half to 2.5 years. And it turns out that lag is, in my view, sort of the Achilles heels of monetarism. And I'll be able to show you that later in the slideshow, that in trying to account for that lag, why does it take so long for prices to go up once money has been increased? 2.5 years, really? Does it take that long? How so? Why so? And it's interesting to see Friedman's explanation, which comes later in the show. Now, probably one of the most famous quotes from Friedman is this one: "Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon." And in fact, his army of graduate students did their empirical work, writing their dissertations under Friedman, to show just that in different countries and different time periods. I remember years ago when I was a graduate student at the University of Virginia, I was invited to give a seminar at the University of Chicago, not by the economics department, but by a little think tank that was at Chicago at the time. But it was attended by students who were working under Friedman monetarism. And just by way of introduction, they asked the students, just go around the room and just indicate what your dissertation topic is. And the first one would say, well, I'm looking at the money supply in Argentina in the period 1930 to 1950, and correlating it with the price level and showing the stability of the velocity of money, which is what you need to then say, okay, variations coming from the supply side to the demand side. And then the next one would have a similar explanation. It'd just be a different country and a different time period, and the next one and the next one. And you got several people around the table, and they would just say, "Oh, you give you the country, give you the time period. You know what I'm doing." That was the business of econometric-minded students at the University of Chicago, to show that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Now, out of this comes Friedman's monetary rule. And of course the rule is you don't want any inflation. And so if you don't want any inflation, then you can't increase the money supply. Now it's not quite that strong because Q and V do change. So you have to allow for some long-term growth. So Q is rising, but V is rising too. So you allow some increase in the velocity of money. And then you figure out how much to increase M year in, year out to correspond to the long-run trends in the other two variables. And if you do it just the right amount without using any kind of on-the-spot discretion about increasing, decreasing, you just stick to your rule, then you get a rule that looks like this. Increase the money supply at a slow and steady rate, 2 or 3%, so as to achieve long-run price stability. And by price stability means, of course, price level of constancy. We can show it with arrows if we must. If Q is increasing a little, then M should increase a little. And here I think I've taken V to be constant, but it can increase a little too. But that would give you a constant price level. And so that's the goal. As we'll see later, Hayek was critical of this even in the 1920s, simply because even though you get a constant price level, you achieve it by pumping money through credit markets. And Hayek referred to this as artificial price level stability, something that would just be unintelligible by a monetarist. They wouldn't know what you're talking about. What's artificial about the price level stability? And of course, Hayek's point was that if you achieve constant price level in this way, as was being done overall largely during the 1920s, just willy-nilly, it wasn't really a conscious effort to imply Friedman's rule, then you get boom and bust because you have interest rates too low during the 20s. It gives rise to the sequence of boom and bust outlined by the Austrians. Now, here, I want to stay with the monetarists and just say that even some monetarists, and certainly some critics, have been critical about Friedman's rule because it wasn't precise enough. 2 or 3%, well, which is it, Milton? 2%, 3%? Make up your mind, and we've got to lock in something. And so Dick Timberlake, who is professor emeritus at the University of Georgia, amended the rule just to give it more precision and satisfy the people who wanted precision. And so here's Timberlake's rule. Dick Timberlake's monetary rule: increase M at a rate of 3.65%, period. Well, one exception, except in leap years when the rate should be 3.66%, okay? So if you're hung up on precision, then that's it, okay? Now, if you look at the data, and of course that's what Friedman did, we can look at inflation measured by the price level, CPI, consumer price level, looks something like that. You get about the same thing if you use wholesale price level or general price level. And you look at the money supply, M1 is what the monetarists tended to use in their equations, sometimes M2, which is a larger monetary aggregate. And what we see here is that at least for a period of time, in fact, during the so-called heyday of monetarism, from the 60s and 70s up through about, turns out, 82. I'll show you why we have a pretty precise date for it shortly. The fit was pretty good. The fit was pretty good. You could see it in the data. In fact, we could even call into question all of the empirical demonstrations, because all it takes is sort of eyeballing the two curves. Once you've eyeballed them, you say, yeah, they move together. And I'm not sure what the statistics really add to that. But let me go back to that in just a minute. But what you can see is that in the later period, after 1980, certainly after 82, it turns out, you can see there's not a very, very good fit. There's M going down for a period, but prices keep going up. Prices going up pretty steadily, and money supply going up in sort of a jerky fashion. The fit is not very good. And as soon as you see the fit is not very good, that tells you that this velocity of money that had been demonstrated to be constant, well, it's not that constant. If you calculate velocity based on the latter part of those two series, you don't get a very constant velocity. This is well recognized in monetarist literature, although I think the cause of it is not particularly well recognized. But I bring in Bradford Long, who's no Austrian or no real harsh critic of the monetarist, but he wrote an article on the triumph of monetarism. He put a question mark about it, and he plots velocity, okay? And here it looks like they're both rising very sharply because that's because we're measuring it in decades. And so we've got decades on the horizontal axis. We're still doing, a little over 1% a year as far as the increase. We're just stretching out the vertical axis relative to horizontal. So you can see, there's an upward trend, and M1 velocity is dark blue. And you can see that trend pretty closely, that the prices, follow money supply. But let's extend it now to a later period and see what happens to both of those, okay? So we're looking at the velocity of money, both predicted just by the earlier trend in the heyday, and is actually observed, which is a jaggy line that goes first up, then down, and all around, and so on. So somehow velocity became unstable after about 1980, 82, along in there somewhere. It's been unstable ever since. If we extended that to the current period, we see the same kind of problem. So we get instability. So Friedman's policy rule lost its velocity anchor, is the way to say it. You know, how do you state the rule now, given that we don't know what velocity is? That's why, by the way, that in the early 80s and even before Greenspan became chairman of the Fed quit trying to target money supply growth or stop paying a whole lot of attention to monetary aggregates and started targeting interest rates, as they have done ever since. Now, here let me offer the reason of what's gone on. I call it the irony of monetarism. And we have to discuss a critical regulation that was in force up to 1982. And that was a certain regulation that imposed by the Federal Reserve that was called Regulation Q. Now that Q is not output. That's not the same Q. It was called Regulation Q because it was in a list of regulations, the first of which was Regulation, can you guess? A. And then B and C. And when you get down to Q, Regulation Q, that's the one we're talking about. And Regulation Q was implemented in the mid-30s, in the midst of the Great Depression. And it was a regulation that provided a very sharp distinction between checking account money and saving account money. And the sharp distinction goes like this, that before you deposit any funds in the bank, you have to decide, do you want to be able to write checks on it, or do you want to be able to draw interest on it? But you can't do both. You can't do both. Make up your mind. Okay, so when you go to the bank, deposit it this way, no interest, you can write checks. Deposit it that way, can't write checks, but you draw interest. That's Regulation Q. It actually also set limits to how much you could draw on saving account, but that's not relevant to our current discussion. What's relevant here is that the regulation itself gave us a very sharp and crisp definition of money. It's currency and coin plus checking account money. That's the stuff you can either spend directly, green stuff and rattly stuff, or the stuff you can write a check on. Okay, but it's not saving, you can't write a check on it. You draw interest on that instead. Okay. Now, during the Carter years and the beginning of the Reagan years, Regulation Q was phased out. Carter began it, Reagan speeded it up. And so by 1982, there was no Regulation Q. And without a Regulation Q, that distinction was blurred. And banks can offer checking accounts on which you can draw interest. You don't draw as much as you might if it were a savings account. Savings account on which you could write checks. Credit union accounts on which you can write checks. Savings accounts that will automatically replenish your checking account when the balance gets so low. In other words, that whole demarcation, that whole boundary was simply eliminated. And so that there was no distinct and relevant monetary magnitude. Oh yes, they still kept track of the M's. They had M1, M2, M3. St. Louis had an MZM, which some of the Austrians, I tend to agree, is relevant more so than some of the others. But it's a huge, MZM is a huge aggregate akin to M3. Just to give you numerical values, M1 is somewhere around $1.4 trillion. And M2 is more like 5-point-something trillion, closer to 6 trillion. M3 is similarly up in the $5 to $6 trillion range. And so as a result, the Fed couldn't implement the monetary rule because it didn't know which M to use. which is why I call it the irony of monetarism, because Friedman generally argues that if you want the economy to perform at its laissez-faire best, you better back off and not regulate, okay? You're generally against regulation, except for one, okay? You have to have one regulation, namely regulation Q, so we know how to define the money supply so we can make it increase in accordance with the Friedman rule and optimize the performance of the economy, you see. To me, it's quite an irony. He would need that one regulation to even pursue the policy. There was a period after 82 that there were some stalwart monetarists advising the Joint Economic Council, and they had Greenspan testifying, as he does every so often. And they pinned him down. Why aren't you following Friedman's rule? Why don't you implement a monetary rule? Why don't you at least tell us what your monetary target is and then stick with it? Okay. And Friedman gave, or Greenspan gave an interesting answer. He says, well, we don't know what money is anymore. Which actually made it to the Jay Leno, or to the Tonight Show, where Jay Leno was able to say, now I don't know what kind of qualifications it takes to be a Fed chairman, but surely you should know what money is. Okay, you should know. But what Greenspan was saying, of course, is we lost our anchor. Okay. So that explains, in part at least, why the Federal Reserve switched from money supply targeting to interest rate targeting in the 1980s. And they pay very little attention to M1 or M2 anymore, because they can't make any sense out of it. Now, I've added here for this morning's lecture a compounding problem that, again, the monetarists and others seem not to have caught on to, the implications of it, but I think it's an important one. And that is, there's all sorts of monetary statistics that you can get directly from the Fed, the what's called FRED, F-R-E-D, FRED, that's Federal Reserve Economic Data. It's maintained at St. Louis Fed. You can find data that will allow you to calculate the currency ratio, because the money supply, whether you're using, let's use M1, is equal to currency in coin. Okay, that's currency means currency in coin, plus checking account money. And for years, the greater part of the money supply was checking account money. Okay, the currency in coin, look, it was there, you have to add it in, but it didn't amount to that much. It was, maybe 25% or 27% or something like that. But in recent years, the currency and coin component has grown up to over 50%, which is sort of counterintuitive. You think, well, gee, I thought it would go the other way. I mean, people are using credit cards, debit cards. They're not carrying around currency and coin as much as they used to in the 50s, let's say, or 60s. They're just not. So how does the currency and coin ratio get so high? Well, there's your answer there, that since about 89, dated to the collapse of the Soviet system, increasingly, U.S. money has been used outside U.S. borders. And it's not just the Soviet Union, although that's a big part of it. In the old Soviet republics, especially for large transactions, U.S. currency is preferable. If you want to buy a house in Lithuania, you better show up with suitcases full of U.S. dollars, okay? That sort of thing. Other countries would rather have U.S. currency than their own, like Argentina. The stores there will say, we prefer U.S. currency, okay? Some countries are just officially dollarized, like Panama, all right? And currency is also held in unstable sections of the world, Middle East and so on, as a store of value, that the stashes, hoards of U.S. currency. When Saddam Hussein was taken down, they found stashes, millions of dollars, in U.S. currency. So the idea is that the Fed keeps track of its currency, and of course the Fed orders it up from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing and then distributes it to each of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. But the Fed keeps track of it at the spigot. In other words, they know how much they've created, but they literally don't know where in the world it is. Okay. And given that, how do you even apply MV equal PQ? Because the Q, if we're applying it to this economy, the Q is output of goods and services in the U.S. But the M is just the M that the Fed has created, some of which is in the U.S. and some of which isn't in the U.S. And they don't know how much. There's no way to keep track of that. All right. And so one of the things that's caused is that to the extent that the Fed actually looks at money aggregate, they use M2 instead of M1, and not because M2 has a lot to recommend it, but because it's a much bigger aggregate and therefore it minimizes the effect of currency. I recently spoke to the director of research at the Kansas City Fed and asked, is there any effort to estimate how much currency is abroad? And well, no effort because there's no way to do it. Okay, they're aware of the problem, but they don't know how to estimate it, but that limits the usefulness of MV equal PQ. Now, from an Austrian standpoint, I think what's important to note is that the Q is, I say Q sub C and Q sub I, meaning the output of consumer goods and the output of investment goods. They just lump it together. They certainly don't have a structure of production where you get different stages and different kinds of investment moving differentially. They don't even allow for differential movements in consumption and investment. They just throw it all together and call it Q. So the whole Austrian theory is in eclipse behind that capital Q. All right? So you can't really pit this theory against the Austrian theory because the Austrian theory is contained within just one of the variables in the equation of exchange. It's also interesting to note that to the extent the interest rate comes into play in monetarism, it comes into play as a way of changing M. Okay? It comes into play on the left side of the equation of exchange. That the Fed can reduce the interest rate and expand the money supply, or increase the interest rate and reduce the money supply. So interest is in play only on the left side of the equation. Any effect that the interest rate might have on the right side of the equation is completely in eclipse behind the Q aggregate. Right? In that sense, Friedman is more Keynesian in his thinking than he realizes, I think, because Keynes himself saw significance in interest rates in terms of what it did to the money supply. So, okay, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but what goes on in the short run, it's not all that short, year and a half to 2.5 years, during that critical 18 to 30 months? Well, of course, what Hayek would say is it's called the business cycle, boom and bust. That's what goes on. And all Friedman has done is come up with a finger in the wind estimate of how long the lag is, but none of his theory seems to suggest why it should be that long. Friedman does have an explanation, but it's one. In fact, if you've had intermediate macro or even principles macro, you've been exposed to this idea, and I'll see if I can't state it very briefly without getting bogged down into it. And it deals really not with monetary theory per se, but with labor market theory and argues for a particular set of dynamics that govern labor markets in the face of an increase in the money supply. Let me give you the summary statement so you know what to look for. And that is that employers and employees perceive price changes differently. There's a differential perception of what's going on with prices to cause them to react in different ways. And it takes a while for the workers to straighten out the perception about what's happened to prices and therefore what's happened to the real wage. And it's that while that constitutes, if we take this argument at face value, the 18 to 30 months that Friedman identifies with the lag. So let's see if we can detail that rising prices create a discrepancy between the real wage rate as perceived by the employer and as perceived by the employee. Think of it this way. You have a business firm. I'll let you be the chief executive officer. And you're producing one good. Call it a widget. You're producing one good. And you're hiring labor at a given wage. Okay? Now, if the Fed increases the money supply, that starts causing inflation and the price of that good goes up. This is Friedman's argument. And the person producing that good will see that instantly. The price of the good that he is producing is higher. He can get more for his output. And therefore, the real wage he's paying, in other words, what he has to pay labor, relative to the price of his output, has fallen. All right? And so he sees that as a movement along the demand for labor, that workers are willing to work more cheaply in terms of what he's producing. All right? So he sees the wage rate has fallen. Okay? The employer sees that the wage rate falling, that is with respect to output prices. The employee sees, but only belatedly, the falling real wage. In fact, take the employee, for instance. He doesn't care about widgets. He doesn't buy the things anyhow. Doesn't know what they're used for. I don't either, okay? But he doesn't know what they're used for. But he gets his wage, and he buys a whole assortment of goods, some of whose prices are rising and some of whose prices are falling. And it's hard for him to detect what's happening to the average of prices. It's not that he's bad at perceiving price changes, it's that he's looking at all the prices of all the things he buys, and he can't tell what's happening to the price average. Meanwhile, this employer starts hiring more labor, and so the nominal wage goes up. It's still low in comparison with the output of the good that the producer is selling, but the nominal wage goes up. And the worker sees that. He's saying, oh, getting an increase in wages. So he's willing to work more. So the employee sees a higher wage, and those get represented by two alternative points on those diagrams. In other words, one of them thinks the supply curve has shifted, the other one thinks the demand curve has shifted. The worker thinks he's getting more money because he's being paid more in nominal terms. The employer thinks he's getting cheaper labor because he's still selling his output for more than he's paying in wages. So this is Friedman's argument. There's sort of a double discrepancy here in what's going on with the real wage. And eventually, workers see it. They say, hey, I can't buy as much as I used to with this wage. It takes them 18 months to see this, or 30 months. I can't buy as much as I used to, so then they demand cost of living raises and so on, and eventually get their wage rate up to where it used to be, and then that's the end of the lag. Okay, that's Friedman's story. If you look at it in the macro books, it plays itself out as a long-run, short-run Phillips curve, where supposedly there's a trade-off in the short run between inflation and employment. In other words, when this firm is hiring more workers, it's increasing employment. Okay. Which is reduction in unemployment. You can see unemployment going to the left there, but eventually prices rise, the short-run Phillips curve shifts, and the boom is over, and you're back, you've got inflation, but no boom. So Friedman has a boom-bust theory that plays itself out in labor markets that are governed by this particular dynamic, this misperception. It's important, though, to see that at least he's got a boom-bust theory, okay? But it works itself out in wage rates and not in interest rates. Interest rates just aren't part of the picture. Now, let me show you this. That just tells you about the Phillips curve. There's that graph again. And this applies to labor markets at any stage, early stage, late stage, it doesn't matter. So that might be early stage, but if we draw a late stage, it looks just like it, okay? It looks just like it because Friedman doesn't make the distinction. So what he's showing is the more labor is being drawn into the labor markets at each stage. If you trace that up to the Hayekian triangle, it makes the triangle taller, but proportionally so. There's no interest rate effect to shift the size of the triangle. Or if you look at it in terms of the production possibilities frontier, it moves out away from the frontier like it does in the case of the Austrians, but with no twist to it. In other words, there's no emphasis on investment. And if you trace down and look at what's happened in the loanable funds market, which is only by implications because Friedman doesn't discuss it, the interest rate isn't changing. Both supply and demand have increased. They're very passive in the Friedman view in that sense. So that's what the Friedman's theory looks like in terms of the Austrian model that I presented a couple of lectures ago. Now, one face of monetarism is that he's recognizing a boom-bust sequence. We'll see later he denies the boom-bust sequence. So he's recognizing a boom-bust sequence that it plays itself out in labor markets. Okay. Now let's look at the sequence a little closely, and we'll see two subfaces of Friedman, which is a problem that he never quite managed to resolve. That if you take his dynamics at face value, then a rise in P is prerequisite to the boom, because you have to have inflation going on for it to be misperceived by workers and employers, at which point the misperception gives rise to the increase in output and increase in labor. And then they sort out their misperceptions, and that precipitates the bust. So a rise in P is prerequisite to a money-induced boom. That is, P must rise and then be differentially misperceived, causing Q to rise as well. So P going up is what causes Q going up. That's his argument. All right. If P doesn't rise, then there's no boom. Now, during the 20s and 90s, 1990s, there was little or no increase in the overall price level. Okay, prices were fairly constant during the 20s. They didn't rise much during the 90s. And so this analysis just doesn't apply. But of course, the Hayekian analysis does, because it all hinges on interest rates and not the price level. Now, I want to show you sort of an internal conflict within monetarism. I've already said and made the case that with the long-run, short-run Phillips curve argument, Q rises to the extent that P rises. Okay, and yet in other parts of Friedman's work, he says just the opposite. He says that one of the major tenets of Austrianism is that early in the boom, output rises without there being any increase in prices at all. Well, if that's true, then it can't be an increasing P that gives you an increasing Q. Okay, and in fact, if you look at MV equal PQ, it suggests that Q rises to the extent that P does not rise. Look, P and Q are on the same side of the equation. And M has risen, so there has to be some combination of increasing P and increasing Q. But if P rose all the way to accommodate the increase in money supply, then Q couldn't rise at all. Okay, so it looks like an alternative there between Q rising and P rising. One of the fundamental propositions of monetarism he sets out in an IEA pamphlet back in 1970 is that when M is increased, Q rises first and P rises hardly at all. So what gives here? Okay. Now, I can reconcile it, I think, in a couple of different ways. One is orthodox monetarism, that's really Friedman. Q rises first. Okay, that's his fundamental proposition. Okay. But then Q rises further as a result of P rising. In other words, Q rises first. And then P starts rising, gets differentially misperceived, and gives a little boost to Q. Okay? But by the time that P rises to reflect the full effects of M, then Q falls back down to where it was. In other words, it's a self-reversing process. You get an increase in Q, but when P rises, Q goes back down. All right? It's a self-reversing process. So Q is unaffected in the long run. That's another fundamental proposition. Q rises first, but is unaffected in the long run. So Q goes up and down while P is adjusting to the monetary expansion. So if you take the three claims together, it suggests a self-reversing process with a flourish. In the face of an increased money supply, Q rises, as does P, but Q then falls to its initial level as P becomes fully adjusted to M. Then, almost as a parenthetical remark, during the process, labor market dynamics can give an extra boost to Q. In other words, if you have this double misperception in labor markets, it gives a little punch to Q on the way up. You could do without that flourish, but it's there in monetarism. So rather than being in direct conflict with one another, as some people claim, Leland Yeager has argued that they're just at odds and Friedman needs to make up his mind, I see it as sort of elements of a self-reversing process. I would also say that his whole analysis about Phillips Curve analysis and about the monetary misperception in labor markets was not intended, even by Friedman, to be a part of monetarism. It was simply a critique of Keynesianism. He was taking the Keynesians on at their own game and showing them that you couldn't exploit a short-run Phillips curve. But that aspect of Friedman's analysis got incorporated in monetarism by textbook writers and other monetarists. So it's considered by most monetarists to be an integral part of monetarism. And I think that's a mistake. So here, the Austrians, the monetarists have identified a self-reversing process that constitutes boom and bust. In the monetarist account, the boom lasts until workers straighten out their perceptions of the real wage rate. Now, my questions here, sort of telling questions of why focus on wages and not on the interest rate? In other words, money comes into markets through credit markets and impinges in the first instance on interest rates. Why tell the story in terms of wage rates, which have this peculiar dynamic of the double misperception? And why should it take 18 to 30 months for workers to straighten out their perceptions of what the real wage rate is? That doesn't make much sense. And here's a research project on the empirical side, if anybody wants one. Why are booms longer in developed economies, the U.S., for instance, than in developing economies, such as South American countries? See, let's give a monetarist answer and an Austrian answer. A monetarist answer was that evidently it takes Americans much longer to straighten out the perception of the real wage. Those South Americans, they're on to it. Okay? That'd have to be the monetarist claim. The Austrian claim is that the U.S. is more capital intensive, and the intertemporal misallocation of labor can persist for a longer period of time before the conflict shows itself up. But in developing countries where the capital intensity isn't that great, it shows up faster. Okay, so you could do a cross-country study and look at different countries, have some measure of capital intensity, have some measure of the length of business cycles, and show, I think, I'll be a Keynes here. If we had the data, they would show that there's a relationship between capital intensity and the length of the boom, which favors the Austrians, of course, over Friedman. Now, I've still got what I think is more of a smoking gun with Friedman, and that is that even Friedman, and early on, was a little leery about this 18 to 30 months. It's an empirical proposition. In other words, his data shows that, it's about 18 to 30 months before prices fully reflect the increase in the money supply. And you had a lot of people asking questions, really? Why that long? And I think he was puzzled himself, and he needed some explanation. What could it be? What could take so long? So here I want to read you an excerpt from an explanation that he wrote back in the 60s and see if you recognize it. I apologize, I just want to read through this for you. so that the Fed's increasing the money supply. The holders of cash will bid up the price of assets. If extra demand is initially directed at a particular class of assets, say government securities or commercial paper, or the like, the result will be to pull the prices of such assets out of line with other assets and thus widen the area into which the extra cash spills. The increased demand will spread sooner or later, affecting equities, houses, durable producer goods, durable consumer goods, and on, though not necessarily in that order. He says these effects can be described as operating on interest rates. He puts it in quotes, on interest rates. If a more cosmopolitan, and I wrote, that is Austrian, interpretation of interest rates is adopted than is the usual one, which refers to a small range of marketable securities. So he's saying this is why the lag might be so long, because you have this money flowing around and affecting interest rates in consumer durables and producers' goods and capital goods and so on. He goes on. The key feature of this process, during which the interest rates are low, is that it tends to raise the price of sources, he says. Sources is just like a long-term capital good, of both producer and consumer services relative to prices of the services themselves. He's thinking in a Knightian view of capital. It therefore encourages the production of such sources and at the same time the direct acquisition of the services rather than of the sources. In other words, you're pulling at both ends of the system here. But these reactions in their turn tend to raise the prices of services relative to the prices of sources. That is, to undo the initial effect on the interest rates. The final result may be a rise in expenditures in all directions without any change in the interest rate of all. Interest rates and asset prices may simply be the conduit through which the effect of the monetary change is transmitted to expenditures without being altered at all. One more short blurb which sort of seals the deal. He says, now listen to this. This is Friedman. It may be that monetary expansion induces someone within 2 or 3 months to contemplate building a factory, within 4 or 5 to draw up plans, within 6 or 7 to get construction started. The actual construction may take another 6 months, and much of the effect of the income stream may come still later, insofar as the initial goods used in construction are withdrawn from inventories and only subsequently lead to an increase in expenditure on supplies. So this is the Austrian theory of the business cycle, okay? This is the Austrian theory, and he says that without recognizing that it comes out of Hayek, okay? So here's my question. So I say Friedman wants us to believe 2 things. One is that the driving force behind the boom is the differential misperception of the wage rate. Okay, that's his theory of boom and bust. But the otherwise implausibly long boom is to be attributed to forces within capital markets as directed by changes in the interest rate. Now, we can't accept that, I think. If that's the reason for the length of the lag, then that's the theory of the boom and the bust. And the misperception of wages is just neither here nor there. Okay. One quote I'll read to you that comes out of a 1982 interview in which there had been a downturn. So it's referring to the period following October 79 when the Federal Reserve had turned its attention from interest rates to monetary aggregates and let interest rates rise. Okay. So Friedman claimed in an interview that the business community had entered into commitments. He called it commitments. The business community had entered into commitments on the basis of the monetary expansion that had begun in April 1980. When the expansion ended a year later, these commitments had effects of their own. He says there was, and this is a quote, a great deal of distressed borrowing, which has served to keep short-run real interest rates high. And then I write, although the terms commitment and distressed borrowing make no showing in Friedman's own theory, they have a natural home in the Austrians' account of boom and bust. Okay, in correspondence with Friedman, I mentioned this and asked him if he'd dealt anywhere else with this commitments and distressed borrowing. And he said, no, that was just for that interview and it only applied to that one episode. Okay, well, it doesn't. I mean, that's the general Austrian theory of boom and bust. So what I'm suggesting here, and I want to leave a few minutes for questions. What I'm suggesting here is that if you take Friedman's argument, and that's the long run, short run Phillips curve, and if you just bring in his explanation for the lag plus his interview in 1982, it converts pretty immediately into the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Okay, it's just not an integral part of his theory. Let me see if I can go. I want to just briefly look at one more thing that I'll give you a real short account of, because it's an important last phase of monetarism. In recent literature, and really in old literature too, back in the 60s, Friedman effectively denies that there are any booms and busts. He sort of pulls the rug out from under himself because he had a theory of boom and bust. And he says in a 1993 publication that if you look at the data, you don't see busts that are in any kind of recognizable relationship with booms. He says what you see is more or less secular growth where income dips below the growth trend and then rises. And it'll dip at different times and to different extents. And he looks at the rising portion as a boom and the next dip as a bust. And he says booms aren't related to busts. He said if we need a theory of the business cycle, it should be a bust-boom theory, not a boom-bust theory. And so this is the last phase of monetarism. I actually wrote an article. There he is. Okay. I actually wrote an article defending the Austrian theory against his, he called it a plucking model. This is a pluck down in various increments. So the last phase of monetarism, he simply denies that there's anything in the data that calls for a boom-bust theory of business cycles. Okay. Thank you very much.